Welcome to Fins, Fur, and Feathers, the Fish and Wildlife Management podcast at K-State Research and Extension. I'm Dr. Drew Ricketts.
And I'm Dr. Joe Gergen. We're both lifelong hunters and anglers, and K-State Research and Extension specialists who help citizens with their fish, wildlife, and pond management needs. If you've ever had a wildlife or pond management challenge, then this is the podcast for you.
We address common fish and wildlife management problems using a scientific approach to provide proven and practical solutions to the issues that you may be facing.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers, and lovely outdoor episode today. And I think, Drew, we're going to talk about some snakes today. So what do you got for us?
Well, you know, it's summertime, time of year when we're most likely to see snakes. And I also just got back from a trip to western Kansas, and where I was at, working in a prairie dog town, there's actually quite a few rattlesnakes around, and we've had some interest on our extension agent listserv about rattlesnake safety and that sort of thing. So I just thought this would be a good time of year to talk about snakes.
Yeah, so we're seeing them more. Why are we seeing them more? Are they here year round, or what's going on in the summer? Why
they're here year round. All of our species of snakes hibernate, so that's their way of escaping the cold temperatures during the winter time. They're ectothermic, which means that they're cold-blooded, right? They get their heat from the atmosphere, from the sun shining on them and that sort of thing. And so when it gets really cold, they go down into the ground and they go into that deep sleep, and that's why we don't see them during the wintertime. But this time of the year, they're very active because they're out doing their thing in that truncated time period when they have to do it.
Yeah. Well, what are they doing this time of year? Are they eating? Are they breeding? Or a little bit of each?
All the above. Yeah. So when snakes are up and active, they're out feeding, they're finding mates, they're breeding. And we've got several different kinds of snakes in terms of reproductive strategies. We've got live-bearing snakes that are going to give birth to live young. We also have snakes that lay eggs in a nest. Garter snakes are one of the species of snakes that's very cold tolerant, so we can see them come out earlier in the year, and we'll see them stay active later into the fall. So that's kind of an interesting example of a species that we have that exhibits at least part of those reproductive strategies that we're talking about.
So you've mentioned garter snakes, you mentioned rattlesnakes earlier. How many different types of snakes are there in Kansas?
Sure, there's 42 different species of snakes in Kansas. 7 of them are venomous. So the vast majority of snakes that you're going to encounter in Kansas are non-venomous. You've got a much higher probability of encountering a non-venomous snake than a venomous snake.
And venomous is the same thing as poisonous. Right?
Well, it's not. Poisonous means you can't eat it without it harming you. And we can absolutely eat snake meat. I'm sure if you drank their venom, which would be the poisonous part of them, then you could have some complications associated with that. But, a snake is kind of like a wasp. A wasp will sting you, and they're injecting you with venom when they do that. And a snake's doing the same thing. It's injecting you with venom when it bites you. And so venomous is the appropriate term.
So they're biting you and they're putting their venom inside you, and that's what might make you sick. And so how many species in Kansas are venomous?
7, but that's a little bit misleading is not the right term. Confusing is probably the more appropriate term. So we've got 2 different species of copperhead. Okay. Most people aren't going to be able to tell the difference. There's the broad-banded copperhead and the Osage copperhead. Depending on where you are in southeast Kansas, you might have an opportunity to see both. But one of those species is pretty restricted in its area down there, kind of in the Chautauqua Hills, south of Yates Center, down to Oklahoma, kind of that area down there. We also have 3 species of native rattlesnakes for sure. So the Massasauga, the timber rattler, and the western rattlesnake. And the western rattlesnake is the one that most people would call a prairie rattlesnake and would be further west throughout the Great Plains, but they get pretty big. The Massasauga also lives mostly in prairies, but they don't ever get much over 20 inches or 2 feet long. So they're going to be a lot smaller. They both have sort of a dark saddle or a dark blotch in terms of that coloration that goes down their back. They're going to have a series of those dark blotches rather than dark bands, which a timber rattlesnake is going to have those dark bands on its back that go crossways. If we think about the other two potential venomous species, there is the cottonmouth, which I would say is probably the most misidentified snake in the state of Kansas. Cottonmouths were detected back in the 90s, way down in the extreme southeast corner of the state, um, Baxter Springs, Riverton, that area. But there wasn't an existing population of cottonmouths within like 100 miles of that area, and there hasn't been one confirmed by herpetologists or scientists since then, since the 90s. And so it's thought that those few individuals were released there. But there's a couple of things about cottonmouths. They've got an incredible amount of color variation, and almost all of those colors match somewhat with our other water snake species. They're going to be around water. And then our water snakes have a lot of characteristics that make them look kind of like a venomous snake. So they tend to be very girthy. So relative to their length, they're fairly big around. They also have keeled scales, which make them have that really rough appearance. And then their heads are really robust, and it can make them look like they've got that triangle-shaped head that we use to identify venomous snakes. So if you think you're seeing a cottonmouth and you're going to hang around long enough to try and figure out if that's what it is, one of the things that you're looking for is, does it have a really strong bar that goes through its eye, like running from its nose to the back of its head. Another thing is the non-venomous water snakes will have vertical barring on their lips, dark vertical bars on their lips, and that cottonmouth's not going to have that.
So you mentioned this venom, I assume, is it for protection, or are they using it for hunting? What are they using this venom for?
They use it for both things, but the main role of venom in a venomous snake is to subdue their prey. But if a venomous snake is threatened, then of course it's going to bite. And oftentimes when they bite, they sort of meter that venom. They're going to inject less venom if they feel threatened, and they're striking because they feel threatened, than if they're trying to subdue a large prey item. But if they have to bite that threatening predator or whatever it is, which is what they would see us as, multiple times, then they're going to inject more and more venom every time.
Yeah. The people that I talk to a lot, they tell me they think every snake is venomous. And so a lot of times they go say hi to them with a shovel and,
Sure.
try to get rid of them. What advice do you have if someone does come across a snake that they think is venomous, or a snake they don't know if it's venomous?
Yeah. I think the best thing to do, if you're not someone who really likes snakes or someone who has good snake identification skills, is really just to go the other way, because almost all the time, not all the time, but most of the time, if we encounter a snake somewhere and we just go somewhere else and then come back in 30 minutes, that snake's going to be gone. And we don't have to worry about fooling with that snake. Really, the worst thing somebody can do is try and catch a snake that they haven't identified, or that they're not extremely confident in that identification. And so, what I typically tell folks, the best thing you can do for yourself from a snake safety standpoint, is learn to identify at least our venomous species. And if you can tell for sure that that's not a venomous snake, maybe you don't know whether it's a western rat snake or a speckled king snake or something like that, then you still know it's non-venomous, and maybe you don't need to worry about it. The one venomous snake that we do have in Kansas that we didn't mention yet is the western diamondback. And there's a little bit of controversy around that one. There's a population of them up around Lindsborg, Canopolis Lake, and that area, and it's believed that those were released there as well, and they've kind of established a population. There are some folks who say that western diamondbacks are native to Kansas because their northern limit in Oklahoma basically touches Comanche and Barber County down in south central Kansas. And so I think it's possible, I don't know these records all that well, but some of those may be coming up into Kansas, and so that they thought it's a native species because of that.
Sure.
But that's the other species, and there's snakes that look like all these that aren't venomous, and so that's a big challenge. You know, I get lots of pictures of what a lot of people will call a corn snake or a Great Plains rat snake. Folks think that they're either a Massasauga or a copperhead. We mentioned the water snakes. A diamondback water snake is a species that we have, and if you don't know what you're looking at, that one can be easy to mistake with the western diamondback, kind of a little bit. If you're not super into identifying snakes, you might even confuse one of those with a timber rattler potentially. So
Well, it's probably, if you're going to side on misidentification, I think misidentify it as something maybe you should leave alone, right?
yeah.
Sounds like maybe that's just good advice in general. If you tend to leave them alone, don't pick them up, maybe your risk of getting bit declines quite a bit.
It does, yeah. Actually, 50% of the people who are bitten by venomous snakes in the United States every year were handling the snake.
Huh.
That's a statistic that always is mind-boggling to me. But just here recently, and I've seen this a couple of different years in a row. I think they're circulating this again because of the time of the year. But there's been this series of pictures in a post going around on Facebook of this young man. All excited because he found this snake, and he's holding this snake up next to his face, and it's a copperhead in the picture. And the next couple of pictures are his hand bitten, all swollen up, and then him in the hospital. And the deal there is, yeah, it might be cool for you to see a snake, but don't be handling them if you didn't for sure positively identify what you had.
Yeah, when I'm out walking around on the land, I see snakes too. I think with wildlife in general, it's probably good just to kind of, let them be on their own,
Yeah.
kind of leave them alone. And there's no real reason to pick them up. There's lots that can go wrong and not necessarily a lot that can go right in those situations. So
Sure.
leaving them alone. And then, the simple thing, wear boots, if I'm working and lifting up pieces of wood, wear some gloves, leather gloves, those types of things.
Yeah.
So, practical, easy things kind of to protect yourself. With the rattlesnakes, I've heard that as they age, every year they get a new segment on their rattle. So is there any truth to that?
That's not true. They gain a segment on their rattle every time they shed,
Okay,
and they can shed their skin multiple times a year.
gotcha.
And so I mean, there's a reason that people say that, and that reason is that they do gain rattles as they get older, but it's not that, counting those rattles tells you exactly how old that snake is.
Sure. So what are these snakes? I mean, we've talked about a lot of different snakes,
Yeah.
right? But just kind of, maybe briefly talk through what they're eating.
Sure.
What's a snake doing on a daily basis?
Sure, it varies drastically depending on which species we're talking about, but we have some snakes that spend almost all their time down in the ground eating the same stuff that moles and armadillos do, grubs, earthworms, and that sort of thing. We've got snakes that most of their diet is composed of insects. We have a lot of snakes that are considered very beneficial because they eat so many rodents, and a wide variety of different rodents that might be pests in our homes or that might cause problems in crop fields and in barns and those sorts of things. My father-in-law tells a story about the black rat snake that lived in their dairy barn when he was a kid, and his dad told him not to ever kill that black rat snake, no matter how bad it scared him. Because that black rat snake was going to take care of the rodents that were in there trying to eat the feed and all that sort of stuff. We also have snakes that eat other snakes, which is surprising to a lot of people. King snakes are very known for that. So we got a couple of different king snakes in Kansas, and they will eat venomous snakes too. But it's not just king snakes. Black rat snakes will eat them. I'm sure that there's several different species too. The gopher snake is it's one of our biggest snakes that we have in Kansas. They can get very large. And that's the one that most people call a bull snake. The accepted name for that species recently changed, and so they went from being a bull snake to a gopher snake. But one of the interesting things to me is what people call different snakes in different parts of the state, right? So where I grew up, if it's a brown snake, it's a bull snake. And I never saw a real bull snake until I got up around Manhattan out in the tallgrass prairie. And those gopher snakes are big and cool looking critters, but they'll eat prairie dogs. So yeah, when I was out in western Kansas this last week, we found a bull snake that I mean, it had a lump in the middle of it about that big long and that big around. So it was in there eating those young prey.
How often do you think it would have to eat one of those?
You know, it takes them, because they're cold-blooded, it takes them a fairly long period of time to digest them.
Yeah.
So I can't give you a good, accurate answer, but I would guess it takes them at least a week to digest a prey item.
Quite a while. Can they still move around while they have that in their belly?
Yeah, a lot of times they're a lot more sluggish. They'll spend more time out laying in the heat to warm up. But one of the interesting things about snakes is they can, even though they're going to lay out in the sun to warm up or lay on rocks to warm up, they also can get too hot. So they might have to go get it in the shade to cool off. But they tend to be more sluggish, spend more time resting when they're digesting, but they can sure get around and everything like that.
Yeah, the movement of a snake, if you watch it, and if you watch it really closely, it's fascinating that they can move, how they can. I also think, we've mentioned a lot of times not to handle snakes. You and I are both trained a little bit into how to do that. So when you pick up a snake and you're teaching a class about it, they're always surprised at how soft they are a lot of times too, So I think, just it's fun to kind of get up close to them and see them a little bit. A lot of people aren't going to think that's fun though, right?
Yeah.
A lot of people aren't going to want to be near a snake. So if I'm don't like snakes, what are some things maybe I can do to help cut down on the number of snakes around me?
Yeah. I'll get to that in just a second. I want to point out one of the things that you mentioned a little bit. You said snakes are soft.
Yeah.
A lot of people think they're slimy.
Yeah.
And, amphibians are slimy, but our reptiles are not slimy. They don't have a coat of slime on them. And so that's one of the important things I think people should know, and that we always try and say when we're talking about them, is they're not slimy. They're going to be dry unless they're in the water. When we were talking about diet, I didn't get to water snakes.
Sure.
So water snakes are going to eat frogs and fish and those sorts of things too. So really, really broad in terms of the types of things that they can eat. In terms of avoiding snakes, so, let's go to our HER acronym that we like to use. So habitat modification, we can use that a lot. And I had never spent a lot of time working in the field around rattlesnakes like I did this last week. And I was working with Charlie Lee, the former wildlife specialist, and the first time I walked up to a gate, I just went stomping through the kochia and the old piled up kochia, and he said, "You're pretty bold to walk through there like that out here in rattlesnake country." And I had to stop and think about it a little bit. And he said, he said, I'd be poking around with a stick. So if you got to be out in heavy cover, you're in an area where there might be venomous snakes. You can poke around with a stick. You can pull the buggy up or the pickup up into those tall weeds before you get to the gate, and then back up. And when you do that, that old rattlesnake will probably shake his tail, letting you know he's there. Then where he's at, and if you can avoid him or not. But another thing we can do is try and limit the accumulation of those weeds. Limit if you've got a whole bunch of kochia or tumbleweeds or something that blows up against your fences right around your gates, go ahead and clean that out. That can be very helpful. Thinking specifically about avoiding rattlesnakes, they like to either warm up or cool off depending on what they need. And concrete floors and shop buildings are great places to do that. And so, try not to walk into a dark shop building if you're in rattlesnake country. Turn on lights. If you don't have lights, turn on a flashlight. Recently, I was helping clean up after a big flood, and we had some clay target machines that throw clay targets that got flooded. And I was getting ready to reach around and flip over a machine that the floodwaters knocked over. And I looked and I saw his head poke out and a tongue go. And my brain went, that didn't look like a snake I'm used to seeing all that often. And I looked around, I got down there, and there was a Massasauga rattlesnake sitting on the throw plate of that machine where I was getting ready to reach and grab. And it's not a place where you would normally see a Massasauga. It got washed down in there by the floodwaters. And so if you're cleaning up in an area, even if it's not an area where snakes might normally be, pay attention. Look before you grab if there's a chance that you could grab something like that.
Have you heard a rattlesnake rattle?
I have.
And how loud is it? Is it something you're going to know? Is it you have to be listening for it, or is it loud enough to kind of know it's there?
I've got pretty poor hearing and I can hear it pretty well.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely, it's not a regular sound. It doesn't sound like the bugs that are going right now, the cicadas, or if we had, other sorts of critters moving around. It doesn't sound like leaf litter blowing. It's a very distinct sound. And I think the first time you hear it, you're going to know what it is.
Sure.
It tends to be pretty startling. We were going along in the buggy last week, and hearing a rattlesnake jump away from the buggy while we're going 10 mile an hour across the prairie dog colony was enough for me to turn around and see this rattlesnake behind us. So even over the drone of the buggy, I could hear
it all
back there.
Yeah. We've talked a lot about like venomous snakes, some of the snakes we want to avoid. What are some benefits of having, there's a lot of other species, right? You said there's 42 total and only 7 of those are venomous. So what are some reasons that all these other snakes might be beneficial to have around?
Absolutely. I mean, it's mainly the stuff that they eat, the service that they provide us by just doing what they normally do. So we've got couple of different species of rat snakes. We've got the gopher snake that I mentioned, even rattlesnakes. Those are all species that are going to eat an incredible amount of rodents, and those are critters that can cause us problems for sure. I mentioned the king snake that can eat other snakes, including venomous ones, and so those are good species to have around. And then pretty much all of them will eat some insect matter and that sort of thing. So they provide us a lot of services that way.
I'm kind of surprised to hear the insects. I mean, that makes sense for like a ringneck snake or something smaller, but sounds like some of the bigger snakes might eat a big grasshopper if it's in front of it.
Yeah, if they come across them, they sure will. And like a garter snake can be a fairly good sized snake, or a ribbon snake can be a fairly good sized snake, and they're going to be more insect specialists. So yeah.
One of the things I remember being fascinated by is the shape of the teeth of different snakes. And I don't know if they have a little bit of curvature to them, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that helps them to kind of keep the prey going one direction while they swallow it.
Yeah.
Is that common amongst different species, or do you know if that's just certain? I know it's common in water snake.
Yeah, I think it's common in all of them. I haven't studied them enough to know that if that holds true for all species, but they generally have teeth, but they tend to not be great big teeth.
Yeah.
That are going to be really obvious. So like even on a black rat snake, it's more like sandpaper.
Yeah.
They probably point backwards, but I don't
know. Well, the reason that we were taught that, and when we were being trained how to handle these snakes, is a lot of people, if you handle snakes enough, you're going to get bit, right?
Sure.
And so your tendency, even when you know what to do, your tendency is to yank them off. And if you do that, the teeth are so fragile that they can break off in your skin, and they're really hard to get off. So a bigger risk of getting hurt from a snake like a water snake would be, getting an infection from where you kind of pulled it off and all those different teeth got left behind. So that's kind of how I know about it with the water snakes. But with other snakes, who knows? But again, probably the best advice: don't be grabbing them in the first place, and they won't be biting you.
So. Along with that, we're thinking about ways or reasons maybe that it's not a good idea to handle snakes. They just about all can have bacteria and fungus and different pathogens on them. And so, if we do handle snakes, it's always really important to wash your hands before you eat. Salmonella is a common bacteria that's on most reptiles, and that's an awful nasty one if you end up ingesting that and get infected. So that could ruin about 12 or 15 days of your life.
Yeah, not a good couple weeks.
No.
So when I get close to snakes, a lot of times I think I can smell them, right?
Yeah.
So do snakes have an odor, or am I making that up?
Well, I know copperheads have a distinctive odor, and because I've smelled it, and a lot of people describe it as rotten cucumber smell. I don't know if that's right. There's a lot of snakes that will emit a musk as a defense mechanism.
Okay.
So garter snakes are a great example of that. If you pick up a garter snake, and many snakes will secrete some discharge out of their vent. It's probably a combination of urine and feces, and also going to have some other things in it that are going to have that musk in them. But that's part of their defense mechanism. They're trying to be nasty and get you to drop them because they're being nasty.
Yeah.
And that may be something that they do before they bite you, or it may just be something that they do independent of ever being interested in biting you.
Sure. Yeah. All of it kind of goes together. I guess if I thought something was trying to bite me or grab onto me, I'd do everything I could to get it to let go too.
I'm not very good at passing gas on command, so I probably couldn't make myself stink to get them to drop me. But
Well, your wife might disagree with you.
Thinking more about how to avoid encountering snakes, we talked about habitat modification around gates and that sort of stuff. But if somebody is extremely snake averse, if they don't want to be around snakes, if they really want to limit how many snakes they might encounter in a yard, limiting the amount of landscaping that we have that includes rocks that are layered piles of rocks, trying to limit taller vegetation in a yard can be important. So, and a lot of the things that might be taller vegetation could be weeds, but it could also be ornamental plants that we put out there. So if you really don't like snakes and you've had a lot of snakes in your yard and you also have, some big pampas grass or something like that, then maybe getting rid of that taller vegetation might be the thing to do. Rock piles, brush piles, any firewood piles, all of those things are going to be habitat for a snake. Open foundations, whether it's underneath a shed or an open crawl space under a house, open porches, all those spots are inviting homes for snakes. A common place that folks oftentimes will encounter snakes when they don't expect to, maybe, is in the water meter pit. Open up that water meter and there's a snake in there. That's the place I used to go look for them when I was a kid.
Yeah.
But I was one of those weirdos that wanted to see snakes. So those are all examples of habitat modification outside. When snakes find their way into the home, it can be really challenging in older homes to try and seal them up well enough that snakes don't get out. If we think about a gap that a snake can get through, even a really large snake could get through a 1/2-inch tall gap that's 1 inch or 2 wide.
Yeah.
They can squeeze through very small openings. So really sealing up, good seals underneath doors, good seals underneath garage doors, and those sorts of things. Any gaps between the foundation and the home, if we have a rock foundation, it may be almost entirely impossible to exclude snakes. So really tightening things up, sealing things up. If you have gaps, fill them with foam, mortar, those sorts of things. Exclusion, I guess the habitat modification and exclusion sort of go together with snakes. If you do frequently find snakes in the home, really the best way to try and get them out of the house and catch them once they come in. I know that a lot of people get squeamish when we talk about this, but the large glue traps, you can find them on Amazon. You can find them in home improvement stores. Not the small glue traps like we use for mice, but the large ones that say that they're intended for snakes. And we can put those behind furniture in a home. Snakes tend to follow structure, and so when they get into a house, they're probably going to follow a wall. And if they hit that wall and then they hit the next wall and that wall goes behind a couch or something like that, then they'll find that glue trap there and it'll catch them. Just make sure you check them fairly often or you might get some stink in the house.
Yeah.
And that's good for keeping pets. If we've got cats in the house or dogs in the house, that keeps the pets from encountering those glue traps and having a problem there. Removal. If you do have snakes that get into a home or if you want to remove them from a yard, if you aren't incredibly competent at handling snakes, a good way to remove them alive would be to go ahead and buy yourself a set of snake tongs and learn how to use them appropriately. So you can get them with those snake tongs, put them down into a 5-gallon bucket, get the lid on there tight, and then you could take them somewhere else if you wanted to, or deal with that snake however you wish to. Most of our snakes in Kansas aren't protected, and if you did have that human wildlife conflict and killing them was what you wanted to do, then that would be a legal thing for you to do and an appropriate thing in some situations. But the reality is that if you just avoid them, killing them is really not necessary most of the time. We can also, and this is kind of counter to what I said before, but we can create some snake habitat in order to catch them too. So you could lay some plywood or some sheets of tin out to get the snakes to come in, and then you could catch those snakes out from underneath of that tin. But then once you got rid of them, then you would need to remove that habitat that you created. The other part of habitat modification that we didn't talk about is reducing food, and that can be pretty challenging with snakes because most of the things that they eat are going to be around anyway. But if we have things in the yard that attract rodents like bird feeders, then we may have more snakes in the yard associated with those bird feeders. And so that could be something that you think about too. But limiting the brush piles and rocks and those sorts of things is also going to limit the snake food that's out there too.
Sure. When I go walk around, I wear cowboy boots, thick leather a lot of times, but they do make chaps and they make special snake boots does any of that work? Does it matter what I'm wearing, or is a snake gonna be able to do whatever it wants through all this?
Well, no, those items, the safety items that you're talking about, snake boots and snake chaps, they're both designed to be tall enough and thick enough that a snake can't bite through them and get to you. And so if you are in an area where you encounter snakes a lot and you're concerned about getting bitten by snakes, especially if you're in an area with larger venomous snakes, then the taller the protection, the better. A large western rattlesnake or a large timber rattlesnake would have a strike zone that was taller than a regular pair of cowboy boots. And the other thing about snake boots is they're denser and thicker, so they would prevent those fangs coming through better than your cowboy boots would too. Snake chaps, if you're in an area with a lot of venomous snakes, then those may be appropriate too. And that's kind of a personal preference. I might die of heat stroke if I tried to wear snake chaps sometimes when I'm out doing my thing. And I tend to prefer just to try and pay attention and avoid them that way. But if you're in an area with lots of venomous snakes and you're concerned about it, then those snake boots and snake chaps can definitely be a good thing to do or to wear. We haven't talked about what do you do if you get bit.
Yeah.
You actually have some experience with that,
Yeah.
don't you?
I do, unfortunately. It was the night before my wife's birthday, about 6 years ago, I think. But I walked outside to go pee out in nature like a good man does sometimes, I guess. But I made the mistake of walking outside, and we live in the country, and I had flip-flops on. And so I walked outside and stepped on top of a copperhead, and it bit me on the foot. And I know some other people that have had similar situations and had a painful foot. About 1% of the population is deathly allergic to the venom, and so I'm a 1%er in the snake venom category. And so I got in bad shape. I passed out. My heart rate was all over the place, and started vomiting everywhere. My wife and neighbors had to load me up in the bed of a pickup truck and race me to the hospital. And I was there. I was not in good shape, and it took them a few minutes to give me the anti-venom. And the crazy thing is, I went from literally on my deathbed there for a little bit to feeling fine. I had an upset stomach, but once they give you that shot, literally within 5 minutes, I felt like I could walk home. My foot was still sore, but I felt a lot better. And so, I was kind of shy. I wasn't sure whether I wanted to share that, mainly because I don't want to build up that fear factor, right? I mean, that's a good example of when I wasn't doing what I knew better than to walk outside in flip-flops. I was just being lazy. And so, but that it's also a real thing, right? So what should we do if we get bit? That's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, they did the exact right thing, and rushing to the hospital, seeking medical treatment as quickly as possible is the best thing that you can do. Don't try and cut the bite and suck out the venom. That's not recommended anymore. Tourniquets are also not recommended. It is recommended that you seek medical attention as quickly as you can, and to keep the bite below the heart, just to reduce the speed of circulating that venom. But no tourniquets, no cutting it and sucking it out. Just get to the hospital as quickly as you can. And it's rare for people to get bit by venomous snakes, but it does happen. And I think you're a good example. You still handle snakes,
Yeah.
right? I mean, you're trained in it, but you know the difference between a venomous snake and a non-venomous snake, and you know why you got bit in that instance. And so you just got to be aware of what's going on and be careful, and don't handle snakes if you know what you're dealing with.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, just elaborate slightly, is you should go to get medical attention whether you think it's venomous or not.
Sure.
Right? And so if you get that bite, you could get an infection, they could have all that bacteria we talked about, and sometimes we might just not know for sure what it was.
Yeah.
So getting checked out and getting it cleaned up is probably always a good idea for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, that was a fun episode, Drew. I really enjoyed chatting about snakes. Fun being outside.
Yeah.
It's just, we're nature guys. We love being out here. And thanks to all our listeners for joining us on this little chat. Make sure you follow us along and follow the YouTube channel. Like us, give us a review, and join us next time for another chat on Fins, Fur, and Feathers.
Fins, Fur, and Feathers is hosted by K-State Research and Extension and is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
The network and this podcast are supported by the Renewable Resources Extension Act.